music, but I also want to encourage you to interject. This is a new experience for me teaching teachers. I mostly teach students like all of you, and now you're students, but I want you to, don't shed your identity as teachers. You need to leave here with ideas and materials to take back to your classrooms, and that's the whole point. We want to benefit from that also when you go back and you start thinking about curriculum and integrating some of the ideas here. We want you to stay in touch with the Music Rising folks, with Rosalind Hinton and the curriculum team that you'll meet at 3:30 today, so that we can improve our own online curriculum that we're going to start making available about New Orleans music, right? So, stay active with that. We really want to know more about how the day-to-day use of this material is going. I've got a handout here which is basically a list of the materials that are on my PowerPoint presentation and that I reference in my lesson plan, so that you can have some substance to start your own research. I have a feeling I'll probably wind up supplementing this as we go along, because again, I'm a little unclear in terms of exactly what you're looking for in terms of materials. So, for instance, there's not a lot of primary source materials or database information ground to cover in this particular session, because you've read about the spirituals, and I want to do a whole lesson on that. But I also kind of want to set up an overview of the course for a little bit and just jet through the syllabus really quickly. You got a copy of the syllabus, right? In your materials. I would guess that most of you have some kind of familiarity with African American music as an art form, as some kind of aesthetic expression of a people that were brought to the United States against their will, and have somehow managed to retain cultural practices despite the horrors of the Middle Passage and enslavement and all these subsequent forms of bondage, the Jim Crow period, the promises of the Civil Rights Movement into our contemporary period, where I would argue that patterns of marginalization that are based on race persist or have been very stubborn. And throughout that history, we have the emergence of these forms of music that really came to define American art, I would suggest. We're going to talk about the spirituals today, ragtime. Eventually, we'll talk about jazz and rhythm and blues music and soul and funk and even into hip hop. And I would guess that some of you, because you're taking this course, have some awareness of that kind of string of styles and their relationship. And this is a true story. It's a very noble story. It's one we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, but I want to try to expand what we can draw from this history, this musical history, and talk about it not only in musical terms, but in social and political and economic terms. It's not the full story. African American music did not flourish in isolation. I think a lot of our ideas about black music come from studies of folklore and anthropology that documented this music over time, but also passed on an idea that that it was a concealed and isolated form of music. And what we're going to see day after day as we go re-chart this trajectory that goes back a couple hundred years is that again and again this was a kind of resounding art form in the public sphere, and it really shaped our ideas in America of African Americans and of what it means to be American. And I think we think of this music as in terms of authenticity, in terms of the authentic expression of a segregated people at times, of a denigrated people at times. Absolutely true. But music has been central to the way people have defined themselves as Americans, and that's the idea that I want to keep coming back to again and again. We're talking about citizenship. We're talking about the presence of African Americans in places where they might not otherwise have been welcome at various points throughout history, but music provided an entry point and a way for their voices to resound in the public sphere. If we were to imagine the abolition movement without slave songs as evidence of black humanity, which is the way we'll talk about it today. If we could imagine the jazz age without jazz, if we could imagine the civil rights period without freedom songs and soul music that were really the soundtrack of our country, if we could imagine right now what your students are listening to, maybe some of you are listening to, that hip-hop is the voice of a generation, a problematic voice for a lot of people, but nevertheless resonating with our experiences today. That's not only to imagine art as somehow separate from politics, which is something I hope by the end of this week is something we're going to have difficulty holding on to, but it's also to ignore the very real presence of black people in our debates over democracy and citizenship, right? So again, I'm trying to shift our music study really into the center of what it means as you're teaching your students about American history, about democracy, about literature, about whatever topics, about music. I know some of you teach music as well. To situate it, right, in some kind of context that's political, that's social, that's economic, that's historical, it's changing over time, right? What does it mean to offer people partial citizenship legally and then to grant full legal citizenship, but document over time how patterns of marginalization continue to exist? I think music is a place we can go where we can find out where those kinds of conversations over time are taking place. It might even help us, and I think this is a question you can help me about. I don't know if this is something teachers are talking about today, but address the current reformist movement in education that's going on to erase racial and ethnic histories from textbooks, right? And this is a very real issue. And some of us live in states where these debates are very lively and active, right, and are happening right now. And I think the retort to that is that these are not minor histories, right? These are not peripheral to the mainstream. They've been central to the project of circumscribing the public sphere as a center of space of power and privilege, right? What George Lipsitz, the great black studies scholar, has a great book called The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, right? I think music is one way we can help interrogate this problem and even build up evidence for it. So what I've done is prepare a series of readings for you that chart the historical trajectory of African American musical styles. We're going to talk about that in classroom discussions like this. We've also got 3 guest lecturers from campus who were there last night who are going to come and lecture and lead the seminar on topics that they're experts on in their own research. Then we've also set up several roundtables, these sort of lecture demonstrations with local musicians. The great pianist Tom McDermott is coming tomorrow evening. We've got some modern jazz musicians coming on Thursday, and some hip-hop and brass band musicians to close it out on Friday. And we're going to get you off campus and out into New Orleans 3 or 4 times to experience some live music. And today we're doing an architectural tour, which I'm actually going on because I've never done it, and I'm really excited about it. We just have this extraordinary opportunity. I tell this to my students all the time, that we're here in New Orleans, and by taking this course, you're obviously interested in black popular music and in New Orleans music, and what an amazing opportunity to be here and to be able to go out and engage with this culture. And we'll talk throughout the class. The class is about, I would say more broadly, African American music and particularly jazz. And then 3 or 4 lectures are devoted to New Orleans music, various aspects of it, and then I'm going to sprinkle stuff about New Orleans throughout. And just like I want you to think about music not only in terms of being autonomous and separate and segregated as art, but as a public space of interaction and engagement, I want you to think about New Orleans in the same way. Yes, of course, it's a very distinctive place. It has its own cultural history and its own cultural forms, and we want to get into those and understand them, but we also want to see what New Orleans can teach us about America in general, because yes, New Orleans is at the periphery of America, both geographically and culturally, right? But it's also been, I would say, by far the main site of cultural production in the United States, right? Without New Orleans music, African American music and American music would sound radically different, right? Without the culture that came from this place. So I want us to integrate, to constantly think of these like all of these social entanglements as not separate little threads, but as all messy, bound up together, right? All right, let me just, any questions before we just real quickly run through the syllabus? Do that for a minute. If you pull that out, I basically set up a chronological lesson plan where today we'll talk about the slavery period, where spirituals are really recognized as the origin of a distinctly African American musical and social expression. Later today we'll do an entire class on New Orleans history in the antebellum period, mostly on Congo Square, which was the site of African slave dances up till about 1845, which is very unique in the United States and also very late for those to continue. And so the question is, what is the relationship between that historical period and the music subsequently that came out of New Orleans after the Civil War? Tomorrow morning, Bruce Rayburn will kick us off. You saw him last night. He's the archivist at the Hogan Jazz Archive, which is the leading jazz archive in the world and a real hub of knowledge for New Orleans music. I'll take over in the afternoon and talk about jazz as it leaves New Orleans and becomes an international phenomenon. And I also want to start at that point reflecting upon our contemporary ideas about jazz and African American music, because one thing we'll have to resolve is, in the contemporary moment when jazz emerges, we have a massive backlash from the white elite against this, what they heard as this very savage music. And then over the course of the 20th century, we can chart the kind of elevation and ascendance of jazz, and ultimately by the 1980s, Congress is declaring jazz America's greatest original art form, and people are calling jazz America's classical music. So society had to catch up, right, with this kind of music, and that's a really interesting phenomenon. My colleague Dan Sharp is going to come in and talk to you about the relationship between the United States and Latin America, especially through New Orleans music. But New Orleans was a port to Latin America at a time, obviously, before airplane traffic was the main cargo. So the shipping industry between New Orleans and Latin America was very, very active, and we wonder musically how that affected the development of New Orleans jazz and American music more broadly. We'll continue on with jazz, a whole course on the swing period, where these big bands were the primary popular music of the 20s and 30s. And then a big break right around World War II with bebop as this very progressive, exclusive, against entertainment form of music. And so there's a real split that happens there, and that'll help us understand, again, this charting course of changing attitudes towards jazz in particular. I want to follow up on that day and sort of carve out a whole class to discuss how race intersects with gender And so we'll read my colleague Sherry Tucker's article about gender and jazz, which obviously I don't think it takes too much convincing to argue that jazz has been this incredibly dominant male space, right, of performance. And the way jazz studies have approached jazz has replicated that kind of pushing women to the margins of history and performance. And I want to sort of go back over some of the eras of classic blues and swing and bebop that we'll have already covered from a sort of mainstream jazz studies perspective, and look at those in terms of how gender and race intersect in terms of marginalization. We'll have another guest come in, Joel Dinnerstein, who's the director of the Gulf South, it's New Orleans Gulf South Center. I always get it wrong because we've had months of committee meetings trying to determine the name. So I have all of the rejected ones in my head still. He's going to lecture on the idea of cool, which is this very African aesthetic that came to define an African American and white bohemian aesthetic in America in the 1940s and 50s, and actually gave a label to a whole subgenre of jazz called cool jazz. So we'll talk, have Joel come in and talk about that. Then I want to, at that point we'll have left jazz with bebop as a kind of very progressive art form. And then what I want to do in the next class is go back to black popular music as social dance music, which is where we'll have been throughout this whole course, and talk about rhythm and blues music, which was really the soundtrack for 40s and 50s America, and also was the kind of raw material for the development of rock and roll, which by the late 1950s was sort of racialized as a white form of American music, right? But we'll be looking at materials at the time where we can tell that in the contemporary moment in the 1950s, this was definitely understood as a black-rooted form of music in rhythm and blues, right? So a really interesting period. The 40s and 50s into the 60s, such a fascinating period of American history. I'm sure a lot of you cover that well. And when we look at it through music, we can really get a different viewpoint of all the post-World War II changes going on in America into the civil rights movement. So we're devoting a whole class to free jazz music, this very progressive, alienating, atonal almost, unmelodic, arrhythmic form of music. Very experimental, very aggressive and progressive. It was the soundtrack for the black arts movements of the 1960s. And we'll look at that in contrast to other musics that are happening in the 60s, white rock and roll, soul music, and funk, and those laid the groundwork for hip-hop, which is where we'll wind up in our last class on Friday, right? And really kind of sink our teeth into that as, again, I love teaching hip-hop here today in 2012 because my students engage with it in ways that they're not critical about at all. It's just they grew up, you know, I mean, with this as their music, right? And some of you, that might be your experience also. I'm 41, so I can remember when hip-hop arrived in the late 70s and early 80s. Our students don't have that experience at all. To them, it's just what's on the radio, right? So that's really interesting. And I'm sure a lot of you have already integrated that into your studies. Okay, that's my little overview. Any questions I ask again? Really? No questions? Someone's got to come up with something.
This is not the most deep question, but
oh, by all means.
Thursday night, dinner and field trip. Is the dinner out in the city?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, actually it is.
It is? Okay.
Oh,
Right.
yes.
We thought we'd take everybody down the quarter and let them loose.
Okay.
And so we've got, we can go to Preservation Hall, but if you want to make a dinner reservation tonight for a 5-star restaurant or Galatoire's or someplace and spend your time doing something like that, you can too. So we'll go down around 6 and come, and the bus will meet, we can meet the bus at 10:30 at night. And we'll tell you more about that.
Great.
Good, thank you.
There's one more chair up here if anyone can't see back there. I know there's a camera.
There's a seat here.
There's a
Spot
chair
right
here.
spot here. Let's see. Should we just kick into spirituals? Any reactions to the reading for today in terms of a lot?
Almost like too much for that.
Oh yeah,
It might be better to react as we go along.
Okay.
Don't let that be an indication to the blank page.
No, I thought
Sure.
that was an excellent article about, I forget which one it was, but what the name of it is, about the whole history of Congo Square.
Okay.
And just thinking about jazz and the improvisation of jazz and just the, latching on to this note, and then just looking at how that evolved and how that happened. I thought, wow, that's great. I didn't know that it came from, this area specifically,
Okay, cool.
so
We're
that's cool.
we're gonna lecture, I think, we're gonna have the seminar till 10:30, then we break. When we come back at 11, that's the topic we're gonna talk about. Yeah.
Well, I thought it was fascinating how, I grew up in this area, and you hear a lot about Congo Square, and you think about all the things that were going on in Congo Square, but actually geographically, all the things that were happening in the periphery as well.
Right.
With all the developments, and so I thought that was fantastic how they framed it.
Cool. We have a lot of interest in Congo Square in New Orleans. I can tell people are eager to talk about that. I think one of the things what's going to happen is, like I said, I have notes that I want to make sure I cover, but your comments will help me know what I should emphasize as we go along. So I'm hearing some about New Orleans and Congo Square. Again, we're not talking about that till 11.
I thought that,
Sorry, I'll get to you next. Go
I
ahead.
thought as a whole, one of the things that I noticed was, for the whole book, was that there seems to be like a discussion over how much of contemporary black music is rooted in African tradition.
Right.
Versus it's more than just African traditions,
Right.
or it's not African tradition.
This is a huge
Yeah.
question that is going to guide at least today and into tomorrow.
But I was amazed at how much hip-hop is represented in this first reading.
Okay,
Like the
interesting.
sampling
Right.
and the...
Okay, so I can make a few comments about that in a little bit.
sort of improvisational nature and the borrowing of melodies
Sure.
and lyrics from other places and mixing
Sure.
it all together.
Right. And I think when I teach the course African American music, that's exactly what I do, is I kind of set up these ideas with spirituals and the instrumental music and chanting at Congo Square, and by the time we get to hip hop, we really have, we know what's coming.
This article, being from New Orleans, this article reminded me of a lot of the same that I learned growing up. Feet don't fail me now. Different things that I heard growing up as a child and going to school here and living here, and so it just brought back memories of the way we speak and the way we were brought up, and how, my grandmother and great-grandmother, and how they related to each other. And the first article about the slave song, I still hear some of in the dialect, the way we speak. It's still similar. And people may say that the old slave songs are your modern day slang and ebonics or what have you. So it started from there because you took what you knew from Africa. And when you came here to survive slavery, you had your chants and your songs to help you through the day, and that just trickled down through time as what we have now in terms of music
And language.
And
like you're saying,
language.
expressions. True. Yeah.
I think one thing that stood out was the songs as humanity. Just because, you know, one of the ways to keep people enslaved was to dehumanize. And I think Douglas talked about it in that short excerpt of his life on the plantation, right? As the songs as being kind of an expression of being human.
Right. This is this how spirituals get sort of deployed. We can almost talk about as abolitionists use them as evidence of humanity in the fight in the anti-slavery movement. Let's actually jump in with that because most of what you brought up already we're going to talk about in class today. Now I want to make one note about tomorrow. Oh yeah, I have 4 pages of notes. How am I ever going to get through all this? All right, I've got PowerPoint too. You're jogging my memory of stuff I want to, big picture stuff I want to make sure we cover. Let's open up with that Frederick Douglass excerpt. You don't need to pull it out, but it wound up in the packets, right? Because this was one that I added later. It's from 1845, obviously his incredibly famous autobiography of a slave. He calls the songs, these are his words, wild, rude, apparently incoherent songs of fellow slaves that impressed him as a child. This was the... Oh, I never did this. Shoot. I got sidetracked.
I just taught the novel before the 2 years.
What's that?
I just taught the novel.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
So, how many of you teach Frederick Douglass in this era? Okay, interesting. You can teach me.
National Council of Social Studies in Seattle, and my presentation on why every American high school student should read the narrative of life of Frederick Douglass in their history class.
Oh, really? And how does the Texas Department of Education feel?
Arizona. We're smuggling them in Arizona.
Arizona just killed its Latino studies program. And Texas is working very hard to remove slavery from their history books. Literally. I mean, I'm showing my colors here, but I think we should leave room for debate about that. But I mean, what I'm describing are facts. I mean, they're literally trying to remove slavery from textbooks. Right. Hold on. Read, every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. So I'm going to tease this idea out in a minute, but here's another quote. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the readings of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. So linger on that for a moment while we listen to the first spiritual recording, 1909, the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And at the end of today, if we get to it, I'm going to talk about the Fisk Jubilee Singers, really interesting.
Coming for
advent, sort of African American music, the first soundings that Americans interpreted specifically as black, right? That which might take some adjustments in your mind. These biblical texts were rewritten as lyrics. They were published in hymnals. They were the same hymnals that were used by white parishioners, and in fact, there were instances in slavery period of these jubilees of mixed race congregations and gatherings. So the spirituals, on the one hand, are the shared point of reference in terms of the songs, but then in terms of the singing, we know from the accounts of the period that they were heard and racially, right? That they mapped onto an emerging American racial identity from the first note. And if we go back to Douglas's observations about the spirituals, and just the very fact that he includes so much ink on them in his autobiography, there's three themes I want to point out for today. I'm going to have a blackboard in here later, and I can write these kinds of things down, but for now let me just spell them out. Music becomes a sign of difference, right? Some type of racial observation and auditory evidence, right, of identity between blacks and whites. If Frederick Douglass says these are wild, rude, and incoherent, that has to be in comparison to some kind of baseline standard, right, that was more restrained and more rational sounding. And he, as somebody who wrote a book and escaped slavery, was able to get some distance and see that in terms of context, right? Second, that music was some kind of entry point into the black experience. Through these songs and through the singing of them, we could understand about the slave experience, right? That's something implicit in Frederick Douglass's narrative. What does it mean to take up the religious hymns of the master and contort them, improvise on them, Africanize them, right? Blacken them, in a sense. These written and orally passed on hymns, so that the sound of the voice falls on white ears as being distinct from the whites, and so that the biblical texts are reinterpreted as a testimony against slavery, right? This is not something you can tell by just reading the words on the page, because obviously spirituals are a universalist Christian message of uplift and salvation, right? So what does it mean to recast that in terms of the contemporary experience of slaves, who are, of course, in bondage, right? Finally, number three, and Josh raised this already, that there's an impetus for this sound and these words to be heard. In other words, this is not only in the quiet Sunday night slave quarters, hushed tones of the slaves, right? This, as Douglass writes, is, quote, to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery, right? So in other words, in the act of singing, and in singing in public, and in singing out loud, there's these voices resounding in the public sphere. We're not talking about concealed, hidden histories here, right? We're talking about the very articulation of emotions and ideas publicly, right? So I think those three things are something we're going to come back to again and again, maybe not explicitly, but that Douglass's accounting of the spirituals, all three of those things are implicit. Did you want to say something?
I'm sorry,
Sure.
I'm curious, only because Douglass isn't saying that slaves sing these songs so that white abolitionists understand that they're really people.
Right.
Douglass is saying, when I go around the North trying to build up support for the abolitionist cause, I tell them about the songs.
Right.
Okay.
He's saying,
where's the purpose?
He's in fact saying, I think these songs are evidence of black humanity, right? and that they're that they can impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery. So there's a lot of things going on there. On the one hand, there's this, like I said, this deployment, like basically we're in a movement and a fight against slavery. The people who want to maintain the slave system are very powerful people economically and politically, and they're waging a campaign. And their campaign, as was pointed out earlier, is that these slaves aren't human, and in fact, legally, they're not citizens. They have no right to vote. They're classified mathematically, what is it, as 1/5 or 3/5, right? In terms of public rights, right? And so we need evidence to prove that these people are human. Culture is one place we're going to go, and the most audible, visible form of culture are these slave songs. And he just needs to point to them, and people will already know what he's talking about. That's their sort of reputation.
And another thing with Douglas, he was basically trying to shame the white upper elite class because they used religion as their foundation for slavery. They justified it. This is why we're doing it, because in the Bible, and they quoted scriptures. Right. So Douglas took those scriptures and those verses, and he turned it around. Then if you base this on principle and foundation of the Bible, where here is something that counters what you're saying. So are you saying because God created me, and he's the Almighty, that he did something wrong by creating this other race, this other class? If you strip off my skin, we all look the same. So then,
right. And
am I not human?
And they're even worshiping the same God in terms of obviously the dominant religion of America in this period, certainly. And so two things I think come out of your comment. One is that there's a argument on behalf of faith and religion, and there's a lot of confusion about religion that I want to get to in just a moment, but also in terms of democracy, right? I mean, of course, this is the argument against the current reformist fight that slavery doesn't teach us anything about America because we're a land of freedom. Well, right, but that's the whole point of this period, right, is that slavery is not some exception, like, oh yeah, but then we have this problem area over here where these people actually aren't free. It's that teaches us about the paradoxes and contradictions of democracy, right? This is the whole debate that's been raging for 10 years about Thomas Jefferson, right, about how could somebody who wrote so eloquently on behalf of the plight of African Americans have run his own domain on the back of slavery, right? So a lot of what this early discussion we're going to have here is a lot of just saying like, oh, see, music matters here too, right? As more evidence, not only of the beauty of black culture, of the humanity of it, as I'm sorry, what was your name again?
Kate.
Kate, right? Was talking about the fact that, yes, that's true, but that also then allowed a whole debate that was raging in America in the 1840s. It matters there, too. It doesn't just matter in terms of the development of music. Yeah.
I think, Kate, were you asking where the intention is on the part of the slaves singing?
Well, what is subversive? Are the songs themselves, they're subversive in their own way because they manipulate or take or change, but it's just the master's text, right? But are they intended to communicate? This is why we're human. No, no, that's Douglas. That's abolitionists taking them and giving them that context of it being about proving the evidence that's proving humanity.
I'll give you 1 second.
Thank you.
Let me answer that. I think actually I won't answer that, but I'll pose a question back to you in terms of how do we know about spirituals as a historiographical, methodological question? How do we know these spirituals existed?
There were written,
Written
oral,
down.
written,
Accounts, right?
oral.
Right. One of the things you're going to notice today is Professor Sakakeeny is not playing you someone singing a spiritual in 1845 because he can't, right? So there's a and there's so we can talk about historical silences, which are really interesting. What is a resource when we go back and try to say what's going on here? Why is Douglas talking about the spirituals? You know, what did they sound like? Well, there's only so far we can go. So on the one hand, we don't actually know what they sounded like, and I'm going to be, I mean, some of the things I'm playing for you today were recorded in like 1978 or something. We're going to have to project backwards to try to imagine that time distance, right? But the other question that you're bringing up is, of course, we don't have accounts from the singers of the spirituals either. We don't know, we can't project their intentionality. Your question is basically, what was the intention in terms of singing? We don't know. My initial reaction is that I don't care, right? Is that that question presumes that there's some kind of real truth and intentionality there, and that that somehow guided things. And I think what history teaches us is that what really matters is that Frederick Douglass thought it was important, that the abolitionists thought it was important, and that in the public sphere this is how things became construed and understood, right? And so the slave's intentionality, which we have very little understanding of what that might have been, is lost to history. But what we absolutely concretely know is that I can print out, you know, Frederick Douglass's autobiography for free on the internet, and that's where ideas of this period come from. Ideas, you know, obviously not just Douglass, but public discourse, right, and written word. You had a question.
Oh, what I was going to say, and it kind of ties into what you were asking, is that we see the stereotypes we see in pictures, and you see where they have the slaves singing and dancing, and it's supposed to, and as if they're rejoicing. So what struck me is when Douglass says that, you know, in slavery, in that condition, how could you be singing for joy?
Right.
You know, so that's what really struck me. So just the interpretation from the outside. You were talking about like the entry point. That's the entry point into the Black experience. That the interpretation was, you know, stereotype. And I think when they talk about Congo Square and how they interpreted the dances of, you know, of the slaves in Congo Square, the same thing.
Right. There's so much embedded in that comment. I think two things I can say right off the bat is we have to ask ourselves what it would mean if society has deemed that your body is an instrument of labor, that your body is, its only worth is monetary, right? What does it mean within that system to have pleasure, to use your body in terms of dance, which is something we're going to talk about in Congo Square, or singing, to sing something that's pleasurable, or to dance publicly in a way that's obviously pleasurable, is talk about subversion. There's something inherent in that. And this is the cultural critic Albert Murray. This is his major idea in the book Stomping the Blues, which is that people don't sing the blues to feel the blues, they sing the blues to get rid of the blues, right? This is his major contribution. So I think that would be one answer. But the other answer to your question is there was a lot of confusion about whether the slaves, from the perspective of slave owners and travelers' accounts, were singing happy or sad music. And a lot of that has to do with music itself. Like, we can actually break down musically why people didn't understand whether the slaves were singing a happy song or a sad song, right? And it's because of the sort of in-betweenness of certain notes in the scale, and et cetera, et cetera. But it also indicates, like you're saying, this general confusion over whether what the emotional register of this music is. Is it pain and suffering? Is it pleasure to get rid of pain and suffering? I think it's just interesting the fact that these debates were happening, right? That people were fascinated by that. Let me keep going here because we have this Christianity problem. Why did slaves take to Christianity? I don't think we can resolve this question because it's uneven. Christianity in the slave experience was very, very uneven. You had certain slave masters where it was very important to them that their slaves learn to read and to read the Bible and to sort of, in their minds, uplift these savage Africans through Christianity, right? You had other slave masters who forbade their slaves to learn how to read or to practice Christianity, right? And so there's a lot of confusion over those two various pathways. But historically, incontrovertible fact, African Americans took to Christianity, right? And of course not universally, but certainly in the broadest majoritarian terms, right? Why?
That's all you had.
That's all you had, huh?
If that's all you had in terms of being a slave, I mean, think about it. If you're a slave and you're not considered a human being, you can't get married, you can't read, you can't write, you can't wear the kind of shoes you want, you can't go to the bathroom when you want to, you have a time to get up, a time to eat, a time to go to bed. What's the only free thing that you have? The time that the slave master gives you, and that one day a week, a Sunday, where you can have that time to yourself. So what do you have on a Sunday? You're sitting around with those who are with you, family, other slaves, and what do? You soak in the only free expression that you have, and at that time, religion was the only thing that they had. So they would sing songs because they could not read. And those who could, they did help them. So,
why not use that sort of psychic space to revert to some type of African religion, say in the first generation of African Americans?
When you're in bondage and you've been in bondage for so long, you're taught to leave that. They were taught to leave what they knew behind and embrace that newness of the new world, which was forced upon them. So
okay, and that, I think that forced upon them question is part of the question, because we don't, like I said, the experience is uneven and forced upon some and not others. So I want to respond to that, but I think there's more questions. You have your hand up?
Well, I was going to say that, I mean, I look at Sunday through Friday as the days that I have to work constantly, 12-hour shifts or something. And Saturday's usually my good day that I have off. Sunday means lesson plans, right? Every teacher hates Sunday. So I think about, like, what could I do with Saturday? I could go to church. Screw that. You know, I could lay around the house and do absolutely nothing. So there has to be something more to Christianity than I've got a break. You know, and one of the big proponents of Christianity is salvation. So the idea that you could wind up, anybody could, if you actually read this stuff, and I think that that would resound with a slave a lot more than I'm being forced to do this. Because I mean, when you look at like labor and stuff, if you were being forced to work, and we know that slavery was completely inefficient because it slowed things down to a crawl. I mean, they knew they had control over how fast that stuff was going to be produced. So a lot of times they didn't produce it as fast as, say, your northern immigrants that could produce things a lot quicker. You know, and that, so the idea was that, you know, there is that subversive element to slavery, but at the same time, Christianity promised salvation, and you have to buy into it. Like, you can't force ideology all the time. And I think that's
is he speaking in terms of the slave or the master? Because it seems like there's a cross or a confusion between Christianity in terms of how a free person thinks and believes, and Christianity in terms of how a person held in bondage thinks and believes. I think he's probably kind of on a track, but I think there's confusion in terms of who he's speaking to.
Well,
The audience of the slave or the audience of the free person.
Well, who says Christianity promises salvation?
Right, that's my question.
The Bible,
What's that?
the whole Bible. Jesus.
Well,
The
right, but I mean,
there were
it's
slaves in the Old
bondage.
Testament that were freed.
who in the direction?
Jesus suffered on the cross. If you
Right.
suffer in life, you will be rewarded.
Right,
in
and this
heaven.
is something we'll see over and over again in the spirituals, is that the Christian biblical promise of salvation maps perfectly onto what
Moses
slaves
led
need.
the
But
slaves out.
I mean, who in the actual orbit of slaves is teaching that
Right.
salvation?
It's like
The slave
they couldn't
owners
read, so where are they, the slave,
The
the
slave
slave
holders,
owner is
slave
basically
masters.
providing them that and telling them, this is what you have to do. This is, you know, this is, salvation is important, and
In
this
some
is
cases,
how you attain
and
it.
then in other cases, they're saying you can't have that
Right.
because we
It's
want you
unattainable.
to stay in your place. So I don't want to get into those generalizations, but who got, if you're a slave looking out at your life, let's say first generation, you were born in Africa, or second generation, you know that your mother is from Africa. You're in a mess. Who got you into this mess? The same person that's telling you
Oh, salvation.
you have salvation through this pathway, right? If from the perspective of the slave, and again, this is all projection, we don't know these things, and they're very, very uneven experientially, but whoever got you into this mess must have some pretty powerful mojo, right? To have worked that thing out. So if there's a guiding theology behind that, possibly one aspect we could look at is from the perspective of the slave, that must be some pretty powerful theology to have gotten me where I am today in this state of both expropriation from where I'm from and the fact that I'm just a object, right, in this society. And what we know is that when African Americans took this form of these ideas of salvation, they transformed them. And in some ways they mapped them onto stereotypically, and it's very hard to talk about Africa because it's a very diverse, large place, but in terms of polytheism and the idea that the dead continue to exist among the living, right? That our ancestors walk around and take on forms as deities. That our spiritual lives and our secular lives are much more enmeshed than in a European idea of Christianity. Those ideas that we can see again and again in African American forms of Christianity that developed after the Civil War and are much better documented. We know that there was some kind of what we call syncretism going on, right? Syncretism is basically hybridity in terms of religion. So it's an incredibly active space. Sorry, you've had your hand up.
I had also read an article that was putting together a correlation between the belief systems of the masters being passed on to the slaves, and the slaves having a concept, of course, who's God, he's all-knowing, he sees everything. And so that they, kind of piggybacking on what you were saying, and also on some modern psychology, Stockholm syndrome, people identify with their abusers after a while. And so what I think there's a correlation to them, adopting this because psychologically, not just spiritually, I think spiritually came much later. I think psychologically they felt like, they had to identify with this because again, the God that the master is identifying is connected directly to him, and clearly the master is in charge. So this God sees all and knows all, and I think it was a way of really keeping them, in line and in fear. Something happening to them if they didn't go along.
I have a lot of stuff I want to get to. I just want to point out this conversation has been really interesting for me. be careful when we veer towards applying what, let's talk about this term agency, this idea, or intentionality, this idea that we as human subjects have goals and aspirations, and we strategize in our lives to attain it, right? We have to be very, very careful attributing agency to someone or something that we know very little about. And so we just can't understand at this time from the slave perspectives what might have driven them to Christianity. What we know unequivocally is that they did, right? And that a chain of events spiraled out from that point, and we can document that chain of events. When we start talking about the, so those are social relations, right? When we start talking about the internal experience of the slaves in terms of imagination, agency, aspiration, we get into really tricky territory.
You opened the door with your question.
Right, I did. Yeah, the right answer.
Explain the relation of agency a little bit.
Okay, well, agency is just the idea that our actions, that we can talk about the way human subjects go about their lives in terms of discourse and in terms of actions, right? In other words, we talk and we write things, and those produce documents, and we can then go back and study them, but we also go out and do things that are practice-oriented. We sing, we wake up in the morning and have coffee, we apply to Gilder Lehrman courses, we spend our Sundays writing lesson plans. Those are, and the agency to go do something like that, it is you know, what pushes you to wake up on Sunday morning, and when you really don't want to write the lesson plan, go ahead and do it anyway. Or not, right? To say, like, I'm not doing that today, and I'm going to wing it in class on Monday morning. That's some form of agency in terms of what we go out in the world and the actions that we do. We can trace people's actions if we have some kind of document that captures it, right? We cannot determine their intentionality or their agency unless we have some insight into who they are as people and what their motivations behind their actions are, right? So in one domain we have some sense of security over events that happened, or at least how historical narratives came out of events that happened. And then we have silences, like we can't hear these slave songs, and silences like just that we're going out and studying slave lives and interviewing slaves. That all came very, very late, right? We have very poor sense of what, from the slave perspective, their experience was. And then we have, of course, historians that go back and meticulously try to reconstruct that, right? You had your hand up.
I was just thinking, Matt, that one of the things that happens is we start to look at slavery as one event, and that all slaves are living a very similar life. And that if you think about it, there's a lot of diversity.
Right.
So there's a lot of different ways. So Joyner Truth is living in New York, and she's just like living in a very tiny household with other people who are Christians. And yet she's holding on to her African traditions when you read her stories, but she is also very much an evangelical Christian. But it's the only game in town, and I keep thinking about Franz Fanon, who says, what happens when you try to resist in the master's language? Because that's the only language you know now.
Right, and so the Bible and the hymnals and the spirituals are the master's tools, and there is absolutely some type of reappropriation and recasting that goes on here. And in terms of the diversity of the slave experience, right now we're talking about the typical plantation model of the rural Protestant South when we talk generally about spirituals and the majority of the accounts about them, right? When we come back at 11, we're going to talk about the New Orleans experience, which is an urban slavery experience and in a very Catholic city that was settled by French and Spanish, right? And so immediately we're going to have a sense of the kind of diversity. I think I should play you some more music and talk about it to make sure we keep our eyes on the prize. Here's a recording from 1930 of the Reverend F. McGee. And he's preaching, and I want you to pay attention to the musicality of his preaching and the way actual music in terms of the musicians that are accompanying him integrate within his sermon. This is just a little excerpt from the end of a recording.
My mother used to tell me, well, when I would be bad, that she knew I wanted to whip it. Because I was paying for it. Now there are lots of folks paying for a trip to hell. And they're sure going to get it. Children, can't you help me sing?
Of course, we have the problem that's going to keep coming up again and again of relating this recording from 1930 backwards. I'd like to bracket that off for a minute. I've already mentioned it, but we'll talk about that today. What I want you to notice is the very ecstatic form of worship and the way music is part of the service, in this case staged for a recording, but based on recordings from this period, it's rather typical, right? And music, always music, and the musicality of the human voice in sermonizing what we later would call black rhetorical speech, right? Especially from the pulpit. The first African American religion to take root was Baptist in the mid to late 1800s. Around the turn of the century, there's a rather large split in the church, and those espounding assimilationist and more sedate forms of worship continued in some forms of Baptist, and those looking to maintain the ecstatic forms of worship formed the Sanctified Church, ultimately the Pentecostal Church, the Holiness Church, Kojic. There's a huge splintering, Church of God in Christ. There's a huge splintering of Protestant sects that certainly by 2012, and I would argue even at least 50 more years earlier, it gets very difficult to say, well, these are the churches where they catch the Spirit, and these are the churches where they have more sedate. We can't really make those hard and fast rules anymore. The point to take away, a lot of black musicians have their first experience with music, singing in church, however formally or informally, because parishioners usually as a rule are encouraged to participate, which is an element of African American music that we'll talk about in the next class. The type of music they came up with is probably more participatory and unrestrained than in comparable white Christian churches. The sacred music at church infiltrated the secular music of everyday life and vice versa. There's a lot of porousness and fluidity going on in between secular and sacred spaces, more than we're accustomed to in separating hymnals and pop music, say, right? That was very quick and dirty. Let's watch, again from 1978, a video made by the folklorist Alan Lomax in Canton, Mississippi, just to give us some sense for those of us who haven't experienced the sort of stereotypical, participatory, ecstatic forms of African American worship. We need to, again, to project backwards, and I know I keep saying I'm going to bracket this problem, but it drives me crazy, so I keep bringing it up in my own guilt. And I want to get to that discussion, but I also want to introduce this, this very core idea. So we get a little sense just from this video here.
I know I've been changed.
Passive church experience, right? What we have here is no separation between the officials of the church and the parishioners, right? We have someone here who's obviously in need of some type of care, and so people are gathering around her and singing, right? And setting up the possibility of some type of ecstatic experience of catching the Spirit, right? And if you listen to the singing, we hear a melody, but we don't hear a faithful rendition of that melody. People, the parishioners, are encouraged to signify on that melody, to improvise upon that melody, to put their own personality through their human voice into there. That's encouraged, as opposed to